a trusted voice of truth and light.
God gave me a gift. I shovel well. I shovel very well.
And a rally point for those who've accepted the reality that they are not sheep.
We've got a blind date with destiny.
And it looks like she's ordered the lobster.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there and welcome to the show. Hey, I appreciate you being a part of my growing audience of wrong thinkers. I don't want to sound too dramatic, but, the cure to so many of the problems that we see today, I think hinges on our ability as individuals to really question, everything that we're being told through mass media. And yes, that would include anything you hear coming out of my mouth as well, because, frankly, if you're not thinking clearly and independently, there's a very good chance you are being led by the nose with this little ring called groupthink. Well, as long as everybody else believes this, I feel pretty safe. Trust me, I've been there. I've been a comfortable adherent of groupthink. I'm in recovery now, and frankly, I don't think I would have it any other way. I've got some great sponsors who make this program possible, including Dixie Chiropractic, HSL Ammo, Sewing and Quilting Center, Monticello College, Life Saving Food, and the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage. So by way of explanation, why do I do what I do? And you might even be questioning, well, what exactly is it that you do, Bryan? You talk a lot, but I have this great love of freedom. And I believe that I have a personal duty to use my personal stewardship, basically whatever talents and abilities and passions God has given me, to speak up in defense of truth and in defense of freedom. And I felt this way for a long time. I mean, it's been probably 30 years that I have devoted to really speaking out. Now, that doesn't mean that I had it all figured out from the beginning. And yes, I have been this voice of authority on everything. I'm still a work in progress, and I'm still learning as I go. But along the way, there have been certain voices and minds and philosophies that have helped to shape my understanding of why freedom matters, what the principles and practices are that it rests upon, and why we have to be so careful not to be led into counterfeits that, tell us, well, our democracy is under attack, and that's why we have to have you do everything we say, and if you don't do it, you're a domestic terrorist, which is pretty much what's happening right now with the January 6th committee. It's all about our democracy, which the political class really is saying our power. So I want to come back to some of the basics. Okay, let's talk about freedom. Never mind labels, Republican, Democrat, whatever, communist, socialist. Let's talk about the principles that underlie proper government. Can we do that? Okay. Frédéric Bastiat is the name that comes to mind when it comes to discussing this. And I don't know that I've had a lot of philosophers that have helped me with my understanding throughout my life. Bastiat is probably one of the most impactful, just because this guy's words have stood the test of time, and he has been my go-to source for so many people who are just starting to get their minds around why does this all matter. And what's the difference? I mean, come on, politicians tell me this, and even respected politicians say this. Why shouldn't I believe them? Well, I want to share with you some thoughts from an essay by Tyler Brandt, writing for the Foundation for Economic Education. And it is such a great bit of information here from Frédéric Bastiat on the connection between socialism, communism, and protectionism. This was written actually back in, 2019, so it's a few years old, but still holds true. Tyler Brandt says, Frédéric Bastiat's writings truly are a gift that keeps on giving. His economic analysis from the early 19th century still reverberates today, more than 150 years after his untimely death in 1850 from tuberculosis. Now, reading through his works is like walking through a garden overflowing with fruit ripe for picking. The hardest part is deciding which fruit to pick. He says, this time on my walk through Bastiat's garden, I decided to pick one of his fruits from the law on the topic of protectionism. Protectionism is hardly a debate particular to the age of Trump. You remember Trump was pretty big on protectionism. It's been hotly contested for centuries. Writing in France in 1846, Bastiat puts his stake in the ground in his satirical essay, The Candlemaker's Petition. And the essay is a stinging and humorous criticism of the arguments in favor of protectionism, wherein Bastiat argues that we should block out the sun to benefit the industries surrounding candle making and other forms of illumination. Now, obviously, nobody in their right mind would argue in favor of this, but it's an absurd conclusion we would reach if we followed the logical extent of protectionism. 4 years after that essay, Bastiat released his magnum opus, The Law, a treatise on natural rights written 2 years after the Third French Revolution. In the book, Bastiat observes the similarities between socialism, communism, and protectionism. And here's how Bastiat puts it, quote, "It is to be pointed out, however, that protectionism, socialism, and communism are basically the same plant in 3 different stages of its growth. All that can be said is that legal plunder is more visible in communism because it is complete plunder, and in protectionism because the plunder is limited to specific groups and industries. Thus it follows that of the 3 systems, socialism is the vaguest, the most indecisive, and consequently the most sincere stage of development." End quote. So Tyler Brandt says the commonality of the 3 systems, Bastiat points out, is plunder. A more common word we use nowadays would be theft or coercion, all of which are well outside the proper domain of law, as Bastiat says. If the main purpose of the law is to protect individuals from having their persons, life, and property violated, and taxation/plunder is a violation of property, then taxation being legal is a perversion of the law. Even more than being a violation of property rights, Bastiat argues it is the opposite, rather, of property rights. In fact, on the term plunder, he says, quote, "I use it in its scientific acceptance as expressing the idea opposite to that of property, meaning wages, land, money, or whatever. When a portion of wealth is transferred from the person who owns it without his consent and without compensation, and whether by force or by fraud, to that person who does not own it, then I say that property is violated. An act of plunder is committed." End quote. Now, accepting Bastiat's definition, we then have a foundational argument against all 3 systems, whether they be Republican-backed, Democrat-backed, or independently backed. Tyler Brandt says the exigencies specific to new problems, issues, or political demands need not matter when refuting systems of socialism, communism, or protectionism. What matters is the principle. Any system that violates the rights of the individual is an unjust system. It doesn't matter if there's a trade deficit or if there's income inequality. So long as a man labors for his bread, he should decide what to do with it, or he should decide, rather, to do with it what he wants. Any policy based on coercing the individual into forfeiting his bread is unjust, Bastiat says. The means of coercion, whether it's the barrel of a gun versus the threat of jail time or property confiscation, doesn't matter, nor do the ends for which the plunder is taken. Foundation for Economic Education founder Leonard E. Reed echoed Bastiat when he said, "Anything that's peaceful. Any system or action based on peace and non-coercion is acceptable. As for systems based on legalized plunder, well, Bastiat says, quote, as long as it is admitted that the law may be diverted from its true purpose, that it may violate property instead of protecting it, then everyone will want to participate in making the law, either to protect himself against plunder or to use it for plunder. Political questions will always be prejudicial, dominant, and all-absorbing. There will be fighting at the door of the legislative palace, and the struggle within will be no less furious. To know this, it is hardly necessary to examine what transpires in the French and English legislatures. Merely to understand the issue is to know the answer." End quote. Now, Bastiat's words are just as true today as when he wrote them with a quill pen in 19th century France. How much of the clamoring and bickering and anger we see today is the result of factions, each vying for their preferred forms of taxation or economic protection? And I would just add to that, that's true at the federal level right down to the local level. Tyler Brandt says, those who believe government to be the chief provider of services seem to demand proper funding for an infinite amount of perpetually underfunded services. But here's the kicker. Nothing will ever be properly funded if the government is in charge of doing so. This is the result of the law not being confined within its proper domain, where plunder is both morally and legally encouraged. So the tie between socialism, communism, and protectionism is plunder, and its acceptability is the cause of most of our political squabbling. Tyler Brandt says we should heed Bastiat's words and keep the law within its proper domain, the collective organization of the individual right to defend our persons, liberty, and property. And he says anything more than that is an improper function of the law.
Well, that sounds pretty simplified.
Yeah, that's it. That's the point. It really is that simple. If you haven't read The Law by Frédéric Bastiat, it's the best starting point I can think of for somebody who really wants to get their minds around the principles and practices of liberty. I'll have a link to Tyler's article in the show notes, which you can access at thebryanhydeshow.com.
This is The Bryan Hyde Show. This is The Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. Want to give a quick shout out here to sewingandquiltingcenter.com. You can check out the link I provide in my show notes under sponsors. Click on it if you would like. Better still, if you live in southern Utah, I would encourage you, just trot right into their store. It's at 779 South Bluff Street in St. George. And this is where you will encounter the finest sewing establishment, well, in southern Utah. Actually, if you're within 200 miles of southern Utah, it's probably worth your time to go there. This is a family-owned business. It's been in operation since 1984. And it is really a one-stop shop for all things that you would need for sewing, from machines up to the really high-end embroidery and quilting machines, the long-arm quilters. I mean, the sky's the limit. You can do as much or as little as you'd like. Entry-level sewing machines are under $200. All the thread, all the supplies, all the things that you would need, including service and training, how to use it, right there under one roof. Oh, and it's owned by some really great people. Teresa and Eric Alsop are the current owners. Reach out, hit them up, tell them, hey, Brian's talking about you on his show, but better still, do some business with them and discover how much fun it is to make things for yourself or for your loved ones. Sewingandquiltingcenter.com. Well, the left's agitation for more gun control is just as persistent as it is misguided. It's also very anti-liberty. Got a great essay here from D. Parker from AmericanThinker.com. What's next for the anti-liberty left's gun confiscation agenda? Now, D. Parker says, bluntly speaking, their non-solutions will lead to more mass murders, so they're going to be agitating in the future, but that was always part of the plan. And you can easily guess what's going to happen next with the historic BSCA, heavy emphasis on the BS, by simply looking at what the anti-liberty left has done in the past. Since their non-solutions were never meant to work, there will be more mass murders. This will give them another opportunity to exploit other people's pain for their political gain. But you have to understand, this is a feature, not a bug, for the liberticidal left. Anti-liberty leftists have an oddly different worldview than normal people, especially when it comes to problems and crises they've created. They see these as just a means to gain power and screw things up so they can rush in, seize more power, and screw things up even more in a never-ending cycle of failure. Therefore, they are very particular about their solutions, while they pretend to be open to doing something, anything, to supposedly keep people safe. Now, you'll notice their solutions are carefully designed to avoid solving the problem, while they enhance their power and set up for future power grabs. See, solving the problem is the last thing they want to do, because if they inadvertently fix things, they've just negated their rationale for existence. We also know where things are going to go from here because they've always followed the same script year after year. Now, if you've ever wondered how the anti-liberty left can make the easy access to guns claim with a straight face, well, here's a simple explanation. They follow a two-step crisis exploitation process that starts with that assertion during these situations. It's their way of making incremental moves toward gun confiscation while they swear up and down that they aren't incrementally moving towards gun confiscation. If all the propaganda media and liberticidal left reactions seem like deja vu, it's because they're always the same. They start off by making all kinds of demands for a ban on undefined military-style weapons of war, licensing schemes, or unconstitutional control over private property with expanded background checks. But now the new wrinkle is unconstitutional gun confiscation orders, or enhanced something protection orders. Anyway, their new assault weapon of choice against the Bill of Rights. All of that should be a red flag, if you will, to anyone that cherishes the cause of liberty. The idea is to push the Overton window as far as to the authoritarian left as possible, making some demands seem reasonable by comparison. And then anti-liberty leftists will call for some sort of compromise. As usual, this is just another example of the liberty deniers lying. A compromise means both sides get something in a deal. This is a compromise where we lose more of our freedom for absolutely nothing in return. Anti-liberty leftists get to place new restrictions on our sensible civil rights. And they get to virtue signal about it while they're pretending that they are liberal and they don't have to give up anything in return. Now, D. Parker says, look, as we would just witnessed, any compromise and anything they get is hailed as historic. A day in our great representative republic unparalleled for at least 20 minutes or so, and then they begin moving on to step 2. Now, you really have to watch out for the whiplash in this part of the process. And this is where they suddenly decide that more needs to be done, and they start downplaying the formally historic achievement they touted mere moments ago. This step will have some timeline variations, but the important aspect is that when the next attack takes place, they can all play that same game all over again. And after the anti-liberty left has successfully diminished the latest surrender deal, they can reset things back to step 1, where any restrictions on liberty are forgotten, and they can quickly tee up the easy access to guns rhetoric once again. Then with the next mass murder tragedy, they can once again call out for something, anything to be done. Something, anything to solve the problem, if that anything is exactly what they specify at the moment. This way they can never be wrong, and they gain more political power each time they screw up. Is there any wonder why they play this game every time around? I'll have a link to this article, and I would recommend to take a look at some of the links included within this article, because there are plenty. If you want to, be fully informed on this, here's a great opportunity. I think this also illustrates something that I know is hard for some people, just because, look, I don't want to sound like some lawless, raving lunatic, and I get it. Drawing a line in the sand, some people are going to say that's exactly what you are. If you're not doing what a politician says or what a politician's written on paper, you are an insurrectionist. You're a seditionist. You're an outlaw. But that ignores the idea that what if a politician wrote things on paper and, called it official, but it was morally wrong? What then? Oh, I know, they're the law and order types. Well, you obey the law and you work to change it. At this point, I don't know if that's the best strategy or not. Now, look, I'm trusting that you're the kind of person who understands what it means to aggress against someone, to initiate force against another person, to behave in an unjust fashion against someone else. And I'm certainly not advocating for that. I am saying, though, you're also probably wise enough that you can figure out when someone is doing it to you. And the question I would hope that you would be able to ask yourself is, hey, am I morally bound to participate or even to help with my own enslavement? Because that's ultimately what every little common sense gun control measure is working towards. Every incremental step that is taken to implement gun control, as D. Parker points out, is a step towards tyranny and away from freedom. And these bloody headlines and, these horrific mass shootings, which, tragic as they may be, are still very much an aberration. We suffer from availability bias where, oh my gosh, it's all they're talking about on the news. We have this impression it must be going on everywhere. Everybody's in danger from it. Not so. But the fear and the uncertainty that's created by the way that this is presented in the media and exploited by politicians, sadly, is enough to convince some people, a lot of young people particularly, maybe the best thing we should do is stand in solidarity and give up our rights or make sure that people don't have access. We must do something now. Get these guns off our streets. Stop gun violence. They're not even sure what they're chanting for. They're just, virtue signaling. I'm doing something. Look at me. I'm helping. Look, I'm speaking to you as someone who loves liberty and has absolutely decided, you know what? There are some things in this life that are worth more than life itself. I think liberty is one of them. I've already made the decision in my mind that I won't be complying. I won't be going along with my own enslavement. Now, if that strikes you as particularly radical and dangerous, I would just like to remind you, I'm a peaceful guy minding my own business, doing my best to make the world a better place in my own way. All I ask is to be left alone. But I got some people who are aggressing and who refuse to leave me alone. How far should I allow them to go? Really?
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. I'd like to send a shout out to the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage, located in St. George, Utah. Heather is your go-to person. She and her team can help you if you are in the market for a home loan. Doesn't matter whether it's a VA loan or a traditional loan or even a reverse mortgage. The Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage has decades of experience and the stability and the clout to help you get the loan you need without delay. And best of all, this is for any of my listeners, either in Utah or Idaho. Heather is there to help you. All you have to do is call her, 435-703-4522. Her NMLS ID is 715386. And Patriot Home Mortgage is an equal housing opportunity lender. Now, I get this is kind of an uncomfortable question to ask, but you got to be pretty brave before you go around wondering out loud, hey, just how bad is the economy? I noticed gas took another 10-cent jump overnight. And, it feels like a kick in the stomach every time I go to fill up the car. I mean, come on. $50 used to be, all right, well, it was, about $50 a fill up. And now, trying to just keep it topped off from a half tank, it's $50 or more. Crazy stuff. But how bad is it really? Well, Blaine L. Pardoe, writing for AmericanThinker.com, I think he has a pretty good take on this. He says, 2 weeks ago, my wife and I drove from Virginia to Michigan and back on our annual pilgrimage to visit family. Covering roughly a third of the nation, our trip was a good opportunity to check the pulse on how the economy is really doing. And he says, I stress really because it's hard to believe that inflation is as low as the government reports. Much of the state of the American economy isn't numbers as much as what you see, feel, and experience as a consumer. By the way, I would agree with what he's saying here. Now, he says, we expected high gas prices. We found them everywhere. The highest we paid was in Ann Arbor, Michigan at $5.49 a gallon. And what we found ourselves doing is filling the tank more often on the trip so that the sticker shock was smaller. But even then, you winced at the price to fill half a tank. The Pennsylvania and Ohio Turnpike rest areas generally have 3 to 4 small food vendors in their food courts. But he says that the ones where we stopped, those numbers have dropped to 1 or perhaps 2. And these are not temporary or staffing closures either. Those vendors are gone. Their spaces abandoned. Those that were open often had reduced hours, and signs were up stating that due to supply shortages, some menu options might not be available. So while no one travels the turnpike system for its food, he says the element of choice, something we've all grown accustomed to, was non-existent. He says, I expected more traffic on the highways. Much of the driving was done on 2 separate Saturdays. Parts of the road that were usually hectic were clear sailing. As much as the media says people are traveling, they aren't doing it on the turnpikes, and either they're avoiding these roads to dodge the toll costs, or the media isn't in tune with how many people can afford to travel. Road construction was big in Michigan. The state has cornered the market on orange construction barrels and has excelled at closing off major roadways, but he says we actually saw little real construction taking place. Still, any progress on rehabilitation of the road infrastructure has to be good news. Some construction was driven by the county, the state, and some were federal highway projects. none of these groups apparently coordinate their activities. Waze literally routed us through neighborhoods in the Detroit suburbs to get around. It's that disjointed. Now, he says, we went to 2 small towns during our trip, St. Clair Shores and Marshall. He says, my nephew is the owner of Copper Hop Brewing in St. Clair Shores, and his business is booming. They've worked with the local community there to come up with innovative and creative downtown events to bring in consumers. Like many entrepreneurs, he has contingency plans in place in case the economy goes into a recession. For now, as always, when times are good, people drink, and when times are bad, people drink. Then he says, we went to my family's hometown, Marshall, Michigan, a quaint town, a slice of Americana. Now, the core of their main street had small businesses still in operation, but once you got out of the heart of the town, there were more than a handful of empty storefronts. Small business is the heart and soul of our economy, and it was clear that it was stretched thin, either from COVID or the inflation that followed. And he says, I found myself wondering, if things get worse, how many of the businesses I saw were going to be forced to close up for good. When you go into restaurants, you'll find messages saying that the prices are higher than shown on the menus. We went into 2 places that had brand new menus, presumably to reflect the inflationary prices. In Biden's America, beer and the menu printing businesses are the only safe bets. He says, no matter where we went, no matter the circumstances, there's one topic that comes up first and foremost, and that is inflation. The people we met with, family and otherwise, we're not talking about the January 6th committee or Roe v. Wade. They talked about their dollars not going as far as they did 6 months ago. Some of it's complaining. Much of it is concern as to how bad things are going to get. He says the people we spoke with felt gas and food prices were at least a third more than what they were paying a year before, if not double. And finally, there's angst in the voices of many Americans. Many believe we're already in a recession, that the government is either lying about the inflation rate or has no clue as to the true state of the economy. The less than subtle hints about Americans transitioning to electric vehicles are falling on frustrated ears. They feel that the government is not paying attention to the real issues that they're dealing with. Worse yet, there's a feeling of concern and fear over what's to come. Worry about how bad things can get. While Biden was out falling off a bike, many Americans were wondering if they would have to use one to get to and from work, or if their jobs were still going to be there a year from now. Again, this is Blaine Pardoe, a New York Times bestselling and award-winning author. And I know that's anecdotal, Brian. What he's talking about is just, his own personal observations. But, hey, you have eyes and ears. I would say what he's describing pretty well parallels what I encounter just, around my own community. I mean, not everybody's walking around in sackcloth and ashes, so it's not like we're woe is us and doom and gloom. But you can definitely feel the vibe has shifted, and people are concerned. In fact, depending on who you talk to, this is my experience is the more informed people are, the more deeply they're concerned. Make of that what you will. But it's very, very clear. Your money does not purchase as much this month as it did last month. And when it gets to the point where you have to start, indexing inflation, on a month-to-month basis or even a week-to-week basis, I think we're headed for danger. I mean, look, my goal here is not to scare you, and it's not to instill fear or anger. But I would encourage anyone who really has some courage and a steely backbone, just do a little bit of research as to what were the conditions like in Weimar Germany coming into through the 20s and into the early 1930s. What were the conditions like, not just economically, but culturally? I think what you'll find will be surprising. And maybe then it'll start to make a little more sense when you start to see some of the things that, look, Pride Month's about to come to an end here, but I just got to say it. I have seen more shocking, video snippets on Twitter of things that were right out in the open. Adult men parading around stark naked in front of children. Oh, yeah, it's just part of the Pride Parade. Now, you can call me a prude if you want, but that's freaking inappropriate. That is not right. Even the guys in the G-strings out there twerking for the kids. How does that square with a normal, healthy society? You know the answer, it doesn't. But it's getting really rare to find people who will call it out for what it is and say, gosh, that is wrong. That is sick and wrong. Drag queen story hour. I mean, come on. This is moving in a direction. And again, I'm urging you, take a look at Weimar Germany. What were the cultural conditions like? And the parallel you're going to find is, yeah, they pretty much turned loose of their morality as well. It was anything goes. Debauchery was totally okay. Come on, party hardy rock and roll. We got to do what we got to do. And then suddenly, for some inexplicable reason, once everybody's morals had been sufficiently watered down or discarded in order to, participate in, the newfound sense of freedom, somebody comes to power who is really, really bad news. Now, the thing I want to understand is why we think we will be any different. That doesn't mean we're going to be wearing funny mustaches and goose-stepping around. But look at the anger the people are expressing over, a Supreme Court decision that kicked the decision-making on regulation of abortions back to the states and the people. In other words, put more decision-making power in the hands of the people. And rightly said, the federal government really doesn't have the authority to do this. And the demonic anger and a literal shrieking that has followed. I guess I don't care who this offends, but we are paralleling 1930s Weimar Germany. Why do we expect that we're going to get a different result from what they got when they finally turned loose of sanity and morals?
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. I feel like maybe I should apologize a little bit. I kind of got wound up there towards the end of the last segment, but maybe I'm just being stubborn. I can't be the only person who is seeing this collective loss of sanity. And I'm not accusing you, mind you. I'm not saying that you're the reason for this. I'm just saying, how can people not recognize where we are headed as a country and as a society? And by the way, speaking of disconnected from reality and just ongoing insanity, let's take a few moments here and talk about some of the questions involved or about how involved the FBI was in the events of January 6th, 2021. I know I'm going to sound like a conspiracy nut. I don't care. Julie Kelly, who is one of the best investigative writers on this subject, points out that there are some very key questions about the FBI's involvement that the January 6th committee won't touch with a 10-foot pole. She says the final set of witnesses testifying before the January 6th Select Committee had the potential to shed more light on the government's foreknowledge of the protest on Capitol Hill that day. Jeffrey Rosen, appointed by Donald Trump on Christmas Eve 2020 to replace departing Attorney General William Barr, and two of his deputies gave opening statements and fielded questions for more than 2 hours last week. None of it had anything to do with the events of January 6, 2021. Instead, Rosen, the Deputy Transportation Secretary under Elaine Chao, wife of Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, before he was promoted in May 2019 to serve as Barr's deputy, spent his time explaining how the former president pushed the Justice Department to investigate election fraud in numerous states after it failed to do so. Rosen recounted multiple requests by Trump, including the appointment of a special counsel. Rosen told the committee members on June 23rd, "I will say that the Justice Department declined all of those requests that I was just referencing because we did not think they were appropriate based on the facts and the law as we understood them." Now, most of the hearing focused on what happened the weekend before the Capitol protest. Rosen vehemently opposed signing a letter authored by Jeffrey Clark, the acting assistant attorney general at the time, that urged Georgia officials to call a special session to examine evidence of voter fraud in that state. Rosen, along with his chiefs and dozens of federal prosecutors, threatened to resign if Trump replaced Rosen with Clark. Now, sadly, Trump didn't take up Rosen's threat. But an offhand comment by Richard Donahue, Rosen's ex-deputy went unnoticed and unexplored by the committee. Donahue explained that on the afternoon of January 3rd, 2021, Justice Department leadership met to discuss preparations for January 6th. Preparations, you say? Julie Kelly says that disclosure gave committee members the ideal opening to question Rosen about the Justice Department's activities days before the protest. Who attended that meeting? What plans were in place to protect the Capitol and lawmakers if violence erupted? What intelligence did the department, particularly the FBI, receive in advance of January 6? But committee members asked none of those questions, of course. And the explanation is clear. Rosen, as well as current Justice Department officials, do not want the American people to know about the agency's deep involvement in the events of January 6. She says if Representative Liz Cheney truly meant her stated goal of exposing the truth about January 6th, she would have asked about a January 2022 bombshell in Newsweek that revealed how Rosen summoned elite commando agents to Quantico that very same weekend to make plans for January 6th. The article detailed how, contrary to the perception Rosen and his colleagues, including FBI Director Chris Wray, have successfully fostered, the Justice Department was not caught off guard and flat-footed on January 6. Rosen made a unilateral decision to take the preparatory steps to deploy Justice Department and so-called national forces, Newsweek reporter William Arkin wrote. There was no formal request from the U.S. Capitol Police, the Secret Service, or Metropolitan Police Department. In fact, no external request from any agency. The leadership in Justice and FBI anticipated the worst and decided to act independently, the Special Operations Forces lurking behind the scenes. Now, the specialized units included the FBI's hostage rescue team, a SWAT team, and agents from the U.S. Marshals Service and Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Snipers were staged near congressional buildings and given shoot-to-kill authority. All of the agents were deployed downtown Washington on the morning of January 6, not in the afternoon as the chaos unfolded, a claim Rosen himself has made under oath. Julie Kelly says, according to Newsweek, FBI tactical teams arrived on Capitol Hill early in the day to assist in the collection of evidence at sites, including Republican and Democratic National Party headquarters, where explosive devices were found. The long-forgotten pipe bomb threat. Not only has that story disappeared from media coverage, it has been completely ignored by the January 6 committee. Nearly 18 months later, the pipe bomb aspect of the January 6 narrative remains one of the murkier events of the day. A hefty reward to find the bomber who allegedly planted the explosives the night before remains unclaimed. FBI officials immediately said the agency would conduct an investigation into what they described as viable devices that could have been detonated, resulting in serious injury or death. But no report has been released. And in the oddest angle of all, Politico reported last year that Kamala Harris was inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters when the bomb was located outside the building, raising questions as to how her Secret Service detail overlooked the device during a security sweep before she arrived around 11:30 a.m. on January 6. Now, one would think Representative Adam Kinzinger, who publicly cried about the violence that happened that day, would pound the podium demanding an update into a lethal threat that could have taken the life of the incoming vice president and others nearby, or at least asked for specifics as to how Rosen's department initially handled the devices. But as Julie Kelly points out, that did not happen. Readers of American Greatness know why. The pipe bomb scare looks like another FBI hoax, complete with characters tied to the agency. And she says, speaking of characters tied to the FBI, the committee has not addressed an issue of great interest to most Americans and some congressional Republicans: the involvement of FBI informants or undercover agents in the Capitol protest. Attorney General Merrick Garland last year refused to tell Representative Tom Massey, how many federal assets participated in the Capitol protest, if any, encouraged others to enter the building, and whether any agents did. I believe Garland's exact words were, "I'm not going to violate this norm of the rule of law, and I'm not going to comment on an investigation that's ongoing." Julie Kelly says Republican senators have also received the silent treatment from the FBI. Jill Sanborn, executive director of the FBI's National Security Branch, stonewalled numerous inquiries by Senator Ted Cruz as to the number of agents and informants who actively participated in the events of January 6. Sanborn also refused to say how many FBI assets may have incited crimes of violence that day. Now, Julie Kelly points out the presence of federal infiltrators is not speculation. The New York Times reported in September that at least 2 informants infiltrated the Proud Boys and helped breach the Capitol perimeter on January 6. Defense attorneys have disclosed the presence of undercover FBI agents in the vicinity of their clients during the protest. Further, dozens of agitators, including Ray Epps, inexplicably have not been charged for their clear role in stoking the chaos that day. And one has only to look as far as the FBI concocted hoax to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer in 2020 to understand just how far the agency will go to damage Republicans, especially Donald Trump. Sanborn apparently was a top official at the FBI's counterterrorism division at the same time the Whitmer kidnapping plot was devised. Julie Kelly says it's unclear whether the committee has even bothered to interview Christopher Wray. Documenting Wray's knowledge and actions related to January 6 would seem an essential part of the committee's official record. Selectively ignoring his role and that of the agency on January 6, well, that points to a cover-up. Now, I understand. Some people would dismiss this as, well, you guys are just grumpy because your guy lost the election. I think there's a little something more that's at stake here. If you look at how the Department of Justice, the FBI, basically the whole federal apparatus has been weaponized, not just against Trump supporters, but anybody who isn't on board with the current administration and is portraying them as domestic extremists, a threat. I mean, you trot out the usual euphemism. It's white nationalists, and it's an existential threat. I mean, there's no nice way to put this. But a target is being placed on each and every one of us who understands the difference between legitimate government and legitimate policy and that which is illegitimate. This is by design. This is to condition the American people so that when moves are made against us, it can all be justified and we're just doing this to save our democracy, which again means to save our power. So for all the questions being asked at that January 6th committee, curious the ones that they're not asking.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.